Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine sitting in a dimly lit room across from an old storyteller. His voice is gravely, yet warm, each word carrying the weight of centuries. He leans forward, and in that quiet, you feel the world itself begin to open. He whispers of a time long before kingdoms, before cities, before even humanity. He speaks of stardust, drifting through the void of atoms colliding in the great cosmic ocean, of life itself sparking from nothingness. What follows is not a tale of kings and empires alone, but of survival and imagination, of struggle and triumph, of how a fragile species carved its mark upon the earth. This is not just history. This is the story of us all. The history of our story began long ago, not hundreds of years ago, not thousands, but billions. Around 3 billion years in the past, life's earliest whispers were nothing more than tiny atoms, drifting together in the great petri dish of the young earth. From that invisible dust, everything we know would one day emerge. Fast forward to nearly 6 million years ago, and something extraordinary appeared. The first hominids, the family of primates that would eventually include us. They were the pioneers, walking upright, reshaping the future step by step. By 1.9 million years ago, Homo erectus became the bold traveler, the first to leave Africa and explore distant lands. With larger brains and stronger bodies, they ventured outward, a spark of humanity lighting up new horizons.
About 400,000 years ago, the Neanderthals arrived. Their stocky frames were built for the brutal cold of Uruk and Western Asia. Their faces, strikingly human, were perhaps the closest mirror of ourselves the ancient world had ever seen. And yet, they too would fade, until only one remained, U.S. Homo sapiens, the final survivor of the genus Homo. But the question is, how did we, fragile and few in number, rise to dominate an entire planet? The answer lies in the birth of civilization. Our story shifts now to the fertile lands of Mesopotamia, around 4000 BCE. Between the mighty Tigris and Euphrates rivers stood the city of Uruk, a place destined to change history. For the first time, humans no longer lived as hunters and gatherers. Instead, they bent the land to their will, harvesting cereal grains like wheat and barley. But the journey from raw grain to food was anything but easy. In those days, people used a simple hand mill, 2 heavy stones grinding endlessly. Grain was crushed into flour, gathered into clay vessels, and stored for the days ahead. A primitive, back-breaking work. Yet it was the very spark of agriculture. For the first time, humans no longer depended solely on nature's mercy. They had created their own food supply. This transformation allowed Uruk to flourish, swelling to more than 50,000 residents. One of the first great cities of mankind, but progress carried a price. The human body itself began to change. Average male height dropped from 5'9" to 5'3". Women shrank too, from 5'3" to barely 5 feet. Once we were lean hunters, swift and athletic. Now we were smaller, tied to the soil, farmers bound to the earth. Humanity itself was reshaped. We became landlocked, tethered to place, altering not just our bodies but the very meaning of being human. And then came legends. In the early 3000 BCE, stories tell of Gilgamesh, the mighty king of Uruk, a ruler so powerful that myth and history blur in his shadow. But his age did not last. By the end of that same millennium, the Akkadians under Sargon the Great rose up and swept away Sumer's glory, forging one of the world's first empires. Meanwhile, far to the east in what is now Pakistan, another miracle was taking shape. The Indus Valley civilization flourished between 331,300 BCE, and while Mesopotamia offered myths and empire, the people of the Indus brought something revolutionary: sanitation. Their cities were equipped with toilets, seats with chutes leading to underground drains, a complex sewage network that carried waste far outside city walls. Disease was curbed. Street stayed clean. Life became healthier in ways the rest of the ancient world could scarcely imagine. From scattered atoms to cities of tens of thousands, from desperate hunters to organized societies, from myth and legend to empires and engineering. This is more than history. This is the story of us, and it is only the beginning. Meanwhile, in Egypt, priorities looked very different. Instead of plumbing, pharaohs poured their energy into building massive pyramids, believing that death was merely the beginning of an eternal afterlife where they would rule forever. Their bodies were carefully mummified, treasures and offerings sealed inside grand tombs to serve them in eternity. It all began with Pharaoh Joseph's step pyramid at Saqqara, followed by Snefrus's bent and red pyramids, and later Khufu's Great Pyramid of Giza, a 20-year feat that still amazes the world. His successors, Khofre and Menkaure, added the second and third pyramids, creating the legendary Giza complex. Across the world in China, around 2100 BCE, legend tells of devastating floods along the Yellow River. Crops were destroyed, famine spread, and survival seemed uncertain, until a man named Yu devoted 13 years to taming the river with levees and dikes. His success saved the people, and Yu was hailed as a hero,
giving rise to the Xia dynasty. Though historians debate the tale's accuracy, it introduced a powerful idea, that leadership should be earned through merit. In Mesopotamia, around 1772 BCE, King Hammurabi carved the foundations of law into a towering stone stele, inscribing 282 rules that bound his people. Some were brutal. False accusations could mean death, and justice often meant an eye for an eye, but Hammurabi's code created a society defined by laws, even if it valued nobles, commoners, and slaves very unequally. Meanwhile, in Anatolia, the Hittites emerged under the rule of Labarnas. Between 1680 and 1650 BCE, he united city-states through war and diplomacy, conquering neighbors and winning allies. A strategist on the battlefield and a shrewd negotiator in the palace, Labarnas laid the foundation for an empire that would challenge the great powers of its age. When Labarnas finally united the scattered Hittite city-states, he transformed from just another ruler into the very founder of a rising empire. His leadership wasn't built on fear alone, it was built on fairness. His people didn't just obey him. They loved him. Under his watch, the Hittites flourished, their influence spreading further and further until their borders pressed right up against the mighty Egyptians. But while the Hittites were securing their empire, something very different was unfolding in ancient Greece. Around 1600 BCE, the Mycenaean world began to take shape. Picture this, not a single unified kingdom, but a patchwork of fiercely independent city-states, each one ruled by warrior kings and centered around fortified palaces. Mycenae, Troy, Pylos, these weren't just cities, they were powerhouses, locked in competition yet tied together by a shared warrior culture. Life here was dominated by hierarchy, honor, and the sword. And from this world came something that would echo through history, the first written Greek language, Linear B, the earliest record of Indo-European Greek we've ever uncovered. These tablets weren't just words on clay. They were the first whispers of a civilization that would one day shape philosophy, art, and democracy itself. Meanwhile, back in Egypt, another kind of pyramid was being built, not from stone, but from society itself. The Egyptian social pyramid stacked people into layers, wide at the base and narrowing to a single point of absolute power. At the very bottom, the peasants and slaves, toiling endlessly in the fields, feeding the empire, and when the crops were done, forced into labor on the pharaoh's massive construction projects. Above them, the artisans, stone carvers, plasterers, sculptors, crafting the treasures and monuments we still marvel at today. Then came the merchants, navigating the Nile, trading gold, papyrus, and linen, turning Egypt into the beating heart of ancient commerce. Above them were the scribes, masters of hieroglyphics, keeping records of everything from food supplies to the pharaoh's commands. Higher still, the soldiers, sworn to protect the empire and strike against its enemies. And near the very top, the bureaucrats, priests, and nobles, managing temples, running regions, and making sure the gods were honored. But towering above all was the pharaoh. To the Egyptians, he wasn't just a man, he was the divine bridge between gods and mortals. Everything in society revolved around him. Taxes, labor, worship, even art, every layer of that pyramid existed to serve the pharaoh's will. And among these rulers, one name still burns brighter than the rest, Ramesses II, the Great. From 1279 to 1213 BCE, he reshaped Egypt, building colossal temples like Abu Simbel, the Ramesseum, and Karnak. He reclaimed lost territories, expanded Egypt's power, and carved his name into history. But not everything was his to claim. To the north, the Hittite king Muwatalli II had ambitions of his own, following in Labarnas's footsteps to expand Hittite power. Inevitably, their worlds collided. Ramesses knew Egypt's survival depended on one thing: striking back. His target, the fortress city of Kadesh. With 20,000 soldiers and his own chariot leading the way, Ramesses marched to war. But unknown to him, the Hittites had spies. Muwatalli already knew his plans, and with 40,000 men, he fortified Kadesh, waiting. The trap was set. Ramesses made a critical error, splitting his forces. Vulnerable and outnumbered, the Egyptians were nearly crushed. Historians believe the Hittites had the perfect chance to wipe him out. But for reasons still debated, they didn't. The result? A bloody stalemate. Neither empire could claim victory. And so, something unexpected happened. Instead of endless war, these two giants chose peace. In 1258 BCE, Ramesses II and Hattusili III, Muwatalli's successor, signed the world's very first peace treaty. Its words were clear: neither empire would ever again attack the other. What followed was a golden period of cooperation. The Hittites shared their mastery of metalwork, teaching Egyptians to forge stronger weapons. The Egyptians shared their agricultural knowledge, improving harvests. Trade flourished. Both civilizations prospered, not by conquest, but by peace. But peace in the ancient world never lasted forever. By 1200 BCE, the Hittite Empire crumbled under relentless attacks from mysterious sea peoples. Their once powerful kingdom vanished into history. And across the ocean, far from Egypt, Greece, and Mesopotamia, another civilization was quietly rising in the Americas. The Olmecs of Mesoamerica, between 1200 and 400 BCE, are often called the mother civilization of the region. Yet even today, so much about them remains a mystery. Their writing system still baffles scholars. But what they did leave behind are 17 colossal stone heads, towering monuments that seem to stare across time, daring us to uncover their secrets. In Mesoamerican belief, the head alone was thought to contain the very essence of a person: emotion, memory, even the soul itself. We may not know their kings and rulers the way we know names like Ramesses or Hammurabi. Yet when you stare into the carved eyes of those colossal stone heads, you can almost feel their presence. In a sense, they remain immortal, frozen in stone, enshrined in history. One day, perhaps, we may finally learn their names. Meanwhile, far across the world, a new dynasty was rising in China, the Zhou dynasty, 1046 to 256 BCE. Their claim to power came after the decline of the Shang, and it rested on a revolutionary idea, the mandate of heaven. This principle shaped Chinese politics for centuries. First, heaven itself grants the emperor the right to rule. Second, because there is only one heaven, there can only be one emperor. Third, an emperor's virtue determines his legitimacy. And fourth, no dynasty has an eternal right to rule. When the signs of heaven turn against you, your power is finished. Those signs came in many forms: droughts, famines, floods, earthquakes. The collapse of the Shang was blamed on just such disasters, clearing the way for Zhou dominance. The Zhou introduced feudalism, a new hierarchy of power. At the base were peasants, bound to the land, laboring endlessly to produce food. Above them stood soldiers, sworn to defend the kingdom. Then came the lords, who taxed the peasants and offered tribute to the king. And at the top sat the Zhou king himself, wealthy beyond measure, while all the burdens of work fell upon the masses. Why would so many people accept a life of toil? Partly because survival demanded it. But also because philosophy gave it meaning. By the end of the Zhou dynasty, two great schools of thought emerged: Confucianism and Taoism. Confucius preached loyalty, respect, and responsibility in every human relationship. He emphasized rituals and customs that maintained harmony. Laozi, by contrast, offered a different path: Taoism. The Tao, or the Way, taught that people should live in tune with the natural order, flowing like water instead of resisting it. Its most famous symbol, the balance of yin and yang, captured the eternal harmony of opposites: light and dark, hot and cold, male and female. These philosophies gave farmers and citizens a sense of purpose, making hardship bearable. But far to the west, Greek city-states were facing struggles of their own. By 800 BCE, Greece's rocky soil could not sustain its people. Grain had to be imported, forcing the Greeks to send colonists across the seas. The city of Miletus alone founded over 90 colonies, stretching from modern-day Marseille to the Black Sea. It was in this world of expansion that a legend was born. Twin brothers, Romulus and Remus, abandoned in infancy and set adrift on the river Tiber. Discovered by a she-wolf, they were raised to manhood, and destined to found a city. But their destiny ended in blood. The brothers quarreled over who would name the city. In the struggle, Romulus struck the final blow, killing Remus. From that act of violence, Rome was born in 753 BCE. While Rome was just beginning, another titan was rising in the east. Cyrus the Great. At the time, Persia lived under Median rule. According to legend, the Median king, Astyages, dreamed that his grandson Cyrus would one day overthrow him. He ordered the child killed, but fate intervened, and Cyrus was spared. Years later, the dream came true. Cyrus raised an army, rebelled against his grandfather, and in 550 BCE, Astyages surrendered. But Cyrus's ambition didn't end there. He conquered Babylon, seized Mesopotamia, stretched his dominion to the Indus Valley, and even absorbed Greek colonies in Asia Minor. He laid the foundations of an empire so vast it would change history. When Cyrus passed, his legacy fell to Darius the Great, who would expand Persia even further. But at the same time, rival powers stirred in Greece. Two city-states came to define the age: Sparta and Athens. Sparta was a society built on war. Weak infants were discarded, boys were taken from their families and forged into soldiers through brutal training. Spartan life was harsh, but it produced an army feared across the Mediterranean. Athens, on the other hand, experimented with a radical idea: democracy. Their system was chaotic yet revolutionary. A council of 500 was chosen by random lottery from 10 tribes, using a machine called the Clariterion. Meanwhile, the assembly gave every male citizen, excluding slaves and foreigners, a direct vote on laws and policies. It was noisy, messy, and often unpredictable. But it was also the birth of a concept that would echo for millennia: government by the people. Not everyone was convinced. The philosopher Plato condemned democracy as reckless. In the Republic, he argued that governance should be left to a philosopher king, a leader guided by wisdom and reason, not chance. Yet history would prove that every ruler, in some way, sees himself as that philosopher king. From Yu the Great in China, to Labarnas of the Hittites, to Cyrus of Persia, all believed their vision was destiny. And in India, another figure was about to redefine destiny itself. Siddhartha Gautama, a pampered prince of Magadha in the 6th century BCE, lived in unimaginable luxury. Inside the palace walls, he knew nothing of suffering. But when he finally ventured outside, he saw for the first time the harsh truths of life: sickness, aging, and death. That encounter would awaken him to a path the world had never seen before. Instead of eternal life, what awaited humanity was death. Just as Gilgamesh had realized centuries earlier, mortality was inevitable. Siddhartha too came face to face with this truth, abandoning his life of riches and privilege to search for something deeper. He wandered, studied with masters, and pushed his body and mind through years of meditation, chasing answers to life's greatest mysteries. After 6 relentless years, he sat beneath a fig tree and vowed not to rise until he found the truth.
In that moment of breakthrough, Siddhartha became the Buddha, the awakened one, unlocking a state of peace and connection beyond the ego, a glimpse of something eternal. From that point on, he roamed the lands, spreading his wisdom and guiding others toward the light of enlightenment. Meanwhile, far across the world, Darius of Persia set his sights on conquest. With 20,000 troops at his back, he marched on Marathon in 490 BCE, ready to crush the Greeks. Yet the vastly outnumbered Athenians, barely half his size, pulled off the unthinkable. Their hoplites ripped through the Persian flanks, sending shockwaves through the enemy lines until 6,400 Persians lay dead against just 192 Athenians. What followed would echo through time. A lone messenger, Phidippides, sprinted the 26 miles back to Athens, breathless but triumphant, proclaiming victory before collapsing in glory, forever immortalized as the very first marathon. But Persia was far from finished. When Darius mysteriously died, his son Xerxes picked up the mantle, unleashing a staggering force of over 100,000 soldiers on Greece. Standing in his way was King Leonidas and just 7,000 Spartans at the narrow pass of Thermopylae. Outnumbered, Leonidas struck first, ambushing the Persian camp in a daring surprise attack. Though the Spartans fought like lions, Persia's endless waves closed in, breaking through the defenses. Leonidas and his warriors fell, but their defiance became legend. Soon after came the tides of Salamis, where Greek ships were outnumbered almost 2-1. Yet the brilliant Athenian general Themistocles lured the Persian fleet into the tight straits, trapping and smashing them in a sea battle that turned the war's momentum. Still, the Persians refused to quit. Under Mardonius, their armies clashed with a coalition of 30 Greek city-states at Plataea. It was chaos, 150,000 Persians against 110,000 hoplites, but on the sloped terrain, the Greeks found their edge. Their discipline, armor, and unity broke the Persian lines, and Mardonius fell on the battlefield. Persia's dream of conquering Greece was shattered forever. What followed was nothing short of a cultural explosion, the golden age of Athens. No longer shackled by war, the Greeks built monuments like the Parthenon, towering above the Acropolis as a symbol of their unmatched creativity and power. And in the heart of this flourishing civilization, theater was born, shaping art and storytelling for the world to come.
Around this time, the city of Athens began to sponsor its most brilliant poets to perform at the grand festival known as the City Dionysia, a cultural celebration held in honor of Dionysus, the Greek god of theater and fertility. This festival didn't just entertain, it gave birth to the golden age of drama, producing legendary playwrights like Sophocles, Aeschylus, and Aristophanes, who shaped the very foundation of Western storytelling. But while the arts flourished, political tensions simmered just beneath the surface. Athens, ambitious and expanding, sought to solidify its influence by bringing surrounding city-states into its Delian League. Meanwhile, Sparta was busy forming its own counter-alliance. The Peloponnesian League, both powers eyed the strategic city of Corcyra with growing suspicion and greed. By 434 BC, diplomacy had failed and war erupted across the Greek peninsula. Naval clashes followed, including the Battle of Sybota and later the Battle of Pylos, each a brutal struggle for dominance at sea. By 421 BC, a brief and fragile peace was brokered, but it would not last. Athens, ever hungry for expansion, now turned its gaze westward towards Sicily. At first, the campaign looked promising. The Athenians secured alliances with local Sicilian cities and won a series of minor victories, but just as momentum built, disaster struck. Alcibiades, one of Athens' most skilled naval commanders, was abruptly recalled to face charges of sacrilege. With his departure, leadership crumbled. The Athenian siege of Syracuse stalled. The city was heavily fortified and well prepared for a long defense. Then came the reinforcements from none other than Sparta. Sparta saw its chance and moved swiftly. Supplies ran low, disease swept through the Athenian ranks, and the Syracusans struck back with a deadly mix of surprise attacks and ambushes. After months of bloodshed, the Athenian fleet was utterly destroyed. Thousands perished. Survivors were either captured or sold into slavery. The war had turned, and the fall of Athens had begun. A decade later, Athens surrendered to the Spartans. The classical age of Greece, the age of myth, reason, and epic conquest, was drawing to a close. Both Athens and Sparta emerged from the war weakened and fractured, never to reclaim their former glory, but this vacuum of power left space for a new kind of ruler to emerge, one who would not just shape a nation, but an entire world. In the East, a divine mandate was coming to an end. After ruling for nearly 800 years, the Zhou dynasty of China had lost the favor of the heavens. What followed was a brutal and chaotic era known as the Warring States period. From 475 to 21 BC, amid the bloodshed, a philosopher named Hanfizi rose with a radically new vision. Legalism. To Hanfizi, human nature was selfish by default. People, he believed, would only act morally when properly incentivized or punished. So he proposed a strict legal code, clear laws, harsh consequences, and absolute control in the hands of a powerful ruler. The ideal state, in his eyes, was one where fear of punishment maintained order. The ruler must control everything: military, economy, society, leaving no room for defiance. Meanwhile, across the ocean in the valleys of what is now southern Mexico, another civilization was rising. In the highlands of Oaxaca, the Zapotec people began constructing their capital, Monte Olban, atop a mountain overlooking the vast valley below. It would become the heart of Zapotec power. Monte Olban wasn't just a city, it was a symbol. At its peak, it was ruled by an elite class that oversaw artisans, farmers, and priests in a tightly controlled hierarchy. The Zapotecs developed early writing systems made of complex glyphs and pictographs. They tracked the stars, developed a dual calendar system, one 260 days, one 365, and engineered agricultural methods to survive harsh climates and drought. Innovation thrived in the mountains of Oaxaca. Back in Greece, in 356 BC, a child was born in the city of Pella in the kingdom of Macedon. That child would become history's most formidable conqueror. Alexander the Great, born to King Philip II and Queen Olympias. Greatness was his inheritance, but his mind was his sharpest weapon. His tutor, None other than Aristotle himself. Aristotle, the father of logic, biology, and taxonomy, instilled in young Alexander a curiosity about the world and a hunger for knowledge. He introduced him to ethics, philosophy, and the scientific method, tools that would one day shape an empire. When Alexander's father was assassinated in 336 BC, the young man was only 20, but his resolve was already unshakable when Thebes dared to revolt. Alexander marched his army to 140 miles in just 14 days. Thebes refused to surrender, and he razed the city to the ground, 6,000 killed. The rest sold into slavery. The rest of Greece, shocked and terrified, submitted without resistance. His next target, Persia. In 333 BCE, Alexander met King Darius III on the battlefield at Issus. Despite being outnumbered, Alexander's tactics led to a decisive victory. Darius fled. Alexander marched forward, conquering cities, including the fortified port of Tyre. Then, in 331 BCE, he faced Darius once more at Gaugamela. The Persian army was shattered. Darius disappeared. Alexander now controlled Babylon and the heart of Mesopotamia. But he didn't stop there. He pushed east into modern-day Iran and Afghanistan. In 330 BCE, he conquered Persepolis, the jewel of the Persian Empire. Yet still, it wasn't enough. Alexander pressed into India, crossing the treacherous Hindu Kush mountains. But his men had reached their limit. They refused to go further. Alexander had to turn back. From that retreat, a new empire rose in India, the Mauryan Empire. At its peak, it spanned vast lands across South Asia. Its most famous ruler, Ashoka the Great, came to power after a bloody war with the kingdom of Kalinga. Over 100,000 people died. Ashoka was never the same. Haunted by the horrors of war, he embraced the teachings of the Buddha. Under his rule, the Mauryan Empire transformed. Edicts were carved into stone, spreading messages of compassion, religious tolerance, and nonviolence. Ashoka abolished slavery and promoted kindness over conquest, a stark contrast to Alexander's legacy in the West. In the Greek world, to die in battle was the ultimate honor. Heroes were immortalized, farmers died forgotten. Alexander himself died at just 32 in Babylon, but his conquest had already reshaped the world, spreading Hellenistic culture from Egypt to India. His teachers' ideas, Greek ideals, were now global. After his death, the empire crumbled. His generals fought among themselves, dividing his lands into three kingdoms: the Ptolemies in Egypt, the Seleucids in the east, and the Antigonids in Greece. All claimed to carry Alexander's legacy. But only one would build something lasting. Ptolemy turned Egypt into a beacon of knowledge. He founded the Library of Alexandria, drawing scholars from across the known world. It became a sanctuary of thought, science, and philosophy, the birthplace of what we now call Western civilization. Meanwhile, Seleucus took control of Babylon, where Greek, Persian, and Central Asian cultures blended in a rich mosaic. But the Seleucids clung tightly to Greek language and customs under Antiochus. 3. The Seleucid Empire expanded massively, stretching from modern-day Turkey to Pakistan. One of history's great empires was now firmly rooted in the east, but the Antigonids, they struggled. Greece, fractured and fading, was no longer the titan it once was. The era of Greek dominance was over, but from the west, a new force stirred. Rome was rising, and before it could dominate the world, it had to face one final obstacle: a city-state with wealth, ships, and ambition to match its own. That city was Carthage. Two great civilizations, Rome and Carthage, were locked in a game of power. A single foothold in the Mediterranean would tilt the scales of history. And so, the First Punic War erupted. After two brutal decades of war, by 241 BCE, Rome emerged victorious. Carthage was forced to accept the Treaty of Lutatius. But peace never lingers where power is at stake. Into 18 BCE, a second war broke out, this time led by a name that would echo through history: Hannibal. Hannibal Barca, the Carthaginian general, stunned the world by leading his army and elephants across the Alps to invade Italy. He won stunning victories, including the infamous Battle of Cannae in 16 BC, but even legends meet their match. In 200 BC, Roman general Scipio Africanus met Hannibal at the Battle of Zama. The outcome? Total Roman victory. Carthage surrendered its territories. The empire was broken, the age of Roman dominance had begun. The West now belonged to Rome, but in the East. A different empire was rising. After the chaotic warring states period, a single ruler emerged, Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of unified China. From 221 to 206 BC, the Qin dynasty reshaped Chinese civilization. And it did so with an iron grip. Qin divided the land into 36 commanderies, ruled with absolute control. Harsh laws, strict punishment, this was legalism in action, no tolerance. No hesitation, obey, or disappear, but even emperors must face the heavens. After Qin Shi Huang's death, the dynasty collapsed into chaos. From that chaos rose a new leader, Liu Bang, founder of the Han dynasty. From 206 to 195 BCE, he shifted China from legalism to the teachings of Confucius, a world of virtue, harmony, and family loyalty, a new empire. Woven with wisdom, under Han rule, trade and prosperity blossomed. Silk, the treasure of the East, became the engine of expansion. In 138 BCE, Emperor Hanwu dispatched envoys westward. A road was forming, one that would connect worlds. This was the beginning of the Silk Road. At first, it was short, but by 97 BC, a Chinese ambassador, Gan Ying, attempted to reach Rome with gifts of silk. He never made it. The Parthians in modern-day Iran misled him, telling him the road would take years. They feared one thing, a direct China-Rome connection, and so 3 giants stood in silent tension, Rome in the west, Parthia in the middle, and China in the east, 3 worlds, orbiting each other without ever touching. But in Europe, Rome wasn't waiting. It was expanding. In 86 BCE, Athens, once the crown jewel of Greek philosophy, became a Roman target. General Lucius Cornelius Sulla led a siege that crushed the city. He plundered its treasures. The torch of power passed from Athens to Rome. And Rome was just getting started. In 63 BC, General Pompey seized Jerusalem and Galilee. Even a small, dusty village named Nazareth fell under Roman control. But expansion didn't stop there. By 58 BC, the Senate sent Julius Caesar to govern northern Italy with orders to conquer Gaul. The Gauls, Celtic tribes from modern France, Belgium, and beyond, fought fiercely to preserve their freedom. Under the leadership of Vercingetorix, they made their final stand at Alesia in 50 BCE. This was not a battle, it was a siege of survival. Alesia was surrounded by double walls and ditches. Vercingetorix held strong inside. Caesar, outside, chose patience over brute force. He built 2 rings of fortifications, one to trap the Gauls in, one to keep reinforcements out. For weeks, the Romans held the line. Vercingetorix's warriors tried to break out. They failed. Then came a second Gallic army, allies of Vercingetorix, charging in for the rescue. Caesar met them head-on. The clash was brutal, but in the end, Roman discipline and strategy won. With no hope left, Vercingetorix rode out and surrendered. The resistance ended. Gaul was now Rome. And Caesar's star was rising. The people loved him, but the Senate, not so much. Caesar had defied orders, grown too powerful, and earned too much loyalty. The Senate issued an ultimatum: disband your army, or be declared an enemy of Rome. He had a choice to make. The Rubicon River marked the boundary. Roman law forbade any general from crossing it with an army. To do so was treason. In 49 BCE, Caesar crossed the Rubicon, and there was no turning back. Civil war exploded. Battles broke out in Coffinium and Pharsalus. The Senate's champion, Pompey, stood against Caesar. Their forces collided in Spain near Ilerda. Though outnumbered, Caesar's brilliance led to victory. He returned to Rome. As its ruler, the people roared, "Hail Caesar!" Hail Caesar, the Senate granted him dictatorship for life. Caesar began a flurry of reforms, building roads, aqueducts, bridges, uniting the empire in stone and strategy, but not everyone celebrated. 2 years later, in 44 BCE, Caesar was betrayed. He was stabbed to death by his own senators, Cassius and Brutus. The empire fell into chaos. And out of the shadows came an heir. Octavian, Caesar's adopted son, just 18 years old, rushed to claim his legacy. He joined forces with Mark Antony, and together they crushed Caesar's killers at the Battle of Philippi in 40 BCE, but soon allies became rivals. In 31 BCE, Octavian and Antony clashed in a massive naval battle, Actium. Octavian triumphed. Antony and Cleopatra fled to Egypt and took their own lives. Rome had one ruler now. In 27 BCE, Octavian was crowned Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. Under his reign, a child was born. In the Roman-occupied city of Bethlehem during a government census ordered by Augustus himself. A woman named Mary gave birth in a stable. The child's name was Jesus. The Gospel of Luke tells us a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. And so Mary and Joseph walked 90 miles from Nazareth to Bethlehem. No room in the inn, just a manger and a stable. A humble birth that would reshape the world. As Jesus grew, his following spread. Stories of miracles echoed through villages, healing the blind, multiplying fish, walking on water. His disciples began recording his life in writings known as the Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, a narrative that would define faith for millennia, but not all saw him as a savior. To some, he was a threat. By the time Tiberius succeeded Augustus as emperor 14 to 37 AD, fear and paranoia ruled the Roman elite. A network of spies called delators reported suspected traitors. Executions were swift and merciless. In Judea, the Roman governor Pontius Pilate was under pressure. Jesus, growing in influence, was seen as dangerous. The political risk was to hide. Following orders from above, Pilate condemned Jesus to die crucified on a Roman cross. The life of Jesus Christ began as a humble story but became one of the most powerful narratives in history. A child born in a stable whose message would reshape the world forever. Yet even as many embraced him, others feared him. Under Emperor Tiberius, who ruled from 14 to 37 AD after Augustus, Rome ran on an intricate web of informants, the delators, who were rewarded for spying on potential traitors and criminals. This was an age where devotion and danger walked hand in hand. Those reported by the delators faced treason trials that almost always led to execution or forced suicide. Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, knew well the harsh punishments for those who defied Rome. As Jesus drew more and more followers, he came to be seen as a political threat. Following the will of Emperor Tiberius, Pilate faced little choice. The emperor's will was law. Disobedience meant ruin, and so Jesus was crucified. Out of this act of violence, a new religion took shape. Christianity at first was only a small sect within Judaism, but its growth was astonishing. Paul of Tarsus carried the teachings of Jesus across the known world, to Greece, Turkey, Syria. With each journey he gained more followers, but also more enemies. The divide between monotheism and polytheism deepened as Rome struggled to understand a population that rejected its pantheon of Mars and Jupiter. And when disaster struck Rome, Christians became an easy target. The Great Fire of 64 AD destroyed 2/3 of the city. Emperor Nero placed the blame on the Christians. To fund massive repairs, he imposed heavy tributes across the empire and printed new currency, sparking inflation for the first time in Roman history. Beyond Rome, resentment smoldered. In Jerusalem, it burst into open revolt. In 66 AD, Jewish forces launched the first revolt, quickly expelling an unprepared Roman army and spreading their movement into Galilee. Nero sent General Vespasian to crush the uprising, forcing most rebels back into Jerusalem. By the time Vespasian became emperor in 69 AD, the city was surrounded. At Passover in 70 AD, the siege tightened. Food and water vanished. Internal conflicts weakened the defenders. By August, the Romans broke through, killing much of the population and destroying sacred sites. Polytheism appeared secure, but the seeds of change had already been sown. Under Emperor Trajan from 98 to 117 AD, the Roman Empire reached its greatest extent. Stretching from Britain to the Persian Gulf, Rome ruled nearly everything it knew, but it had no idea of the Americas. Across the Andes in what is now Peru and Chile, the Mocha civilization built monumental pyramids like Huaca del Sol and Huaca de la Luna, developed advanced fertilization techniques using bird droppings, and organized a rigidly centralized society. Farther south, a different mystery unfolded. In the Nazca Desert, massive geoglyphs, geometric patterns, animals, human-like figures were carved into the earth. Known as the Nazca Lines, their meaning remains unknown, sparking endless speculation. Around 100 AD, the Zapotec established Monte Alban, one of the first grid-planned cities in the Americas. Divided into specialized districts with public plazas and sacred buildings, it thrived for 1,000 years. Yet even as new worlds were rising, Rome faced its own tests. After Trajan's death, Hadrian inherited an empire stretched thin. In Britain, uprisings threatened Roman control. Hadrian ordered the construction of a massive barrier, Hadrian's Wall, running nearly coast to coast to reinforce the power of Rome in the minds of its subjects. But Judea once again simmered with rebellion. Simon Bar Kokhba emerged as leader of the Jewish people, resisting Roman rule as the empire built Aelia Capitolina over Jerusalem's ruins, filling it with temples to Jupiter and other gods. By 130 AD, Bar Kokhba was hailed by many as Messiah, storming the Roman garrison. Hadrian would not tolerate it. He sent 120,000 troops to crush the revolt. Ancient historian Cassius Dio records that 50 key outposts and 985 villages were destroyed, 580,000 men slain, and famine and fire claiming countless others. Judea lay desolate. Rome had made its warning clear. While Rome ruled through fear, China was uniting through ideas. Buddhism spread alongside Confucianism and Taoism, strengthening the Han dynasty. Across the ocean, the Maya were designing monumental temples in northern Peton with wide staircases and immense stucco masks embodying their gods. Temples like E7 Sub displayed 16 such masks, each a gateway into the divine. Belief and power were shaping worlds thousands of miles apart. In the middle east, yet another empire was taking shape. Artasher claimed descent from Cyrus the Great and declared himself rightful ruler of Persia. Into 24 AD at Hormozgan, his Sasanian cavalry defeated the Parthians and captured their king. Artasher founded the Sasanian Empire, centralizing power, rebuilding Ctesiphon on the Tigris, reinstating Zoroastrianism as the state religion, and building a formidable military of archers and cavalry. From old empires came new ones, each rising to challenge the order of the world. Across continents, faith and power, conquest and culture intertwined. In every empire the same choice echoed, adapt or perish. This was how belief, ambition, and resilience built the world we inherit today. As the Parthians faded from power, the Han dynasty too was entering its twilight. Political instability, economic collapse, foreign threats, internal rebellions, and vicious power struggles undermined its core. Central authority crumbled, and regional warlords stepped into the vacuum. Attempts to fix the economy failed. Threats on the borders and uprisings within weakened the dynasty further. Out of this chaos a new ruler rose, a warlord named Cao Pi. Declaring himself emperor, he founded the Wei dynasty, ending the centuries-long rule of the Han. While China fractured, Rome faced its own crisis. Emperor Diocletian, ruling from 284 to 305 AD, saw an empire too large to govern. His answer was radical: divide it. He created the Tetrarchy, splitting the empire into 4 regions, each ruled by its own emperor, to Senior Augusti, to Junior Caesars. Diocletian made Maximian his equal as Augustus, while Galerius and Constantius became Caesars. But the system meant to stabilize Rome instead fueled chaos. Ambition burned in each ruler's heart, and the balance could not last. By 305, both Diocletian and Maximian retired, leaving a power vacuum. When Constantius died in 306, his army unilaterally elevated his son Constantine, naming him both Augustus and Caesar, a direct challenge to the system. At the same time, Maximian's son Maxentius claimed the throne, enraged that Valerius Severus had been appointed instead of him. In 307, Maxentius forced Severus to surrender. By 308, Galerius brought in Licinius as yet another claimant. The empire was now split between Constantine in Gaul and Britain and Maxentius in Italy and North Africa. 2 leaders, 1 empire, no peace. Maxentius, desperate to secure his power, commissioned a grand bridge across the Tiber, the Milvian Bridge, a show of strength near Rome itself. Constantine saw his rivals rise as a threat. Marching his forces toward the city, he prepared for a decisive showdown. On the eve of battle, Constantine reportedly saw a cross in the sky with the words, "In the sign, conquer." Whether dream, vision, or divine omen, he embraced it. His soldiers painted the Christian symbol on their shields and banners. Hope turned to confidence. The battle began. The fighting at the Milvian Bridge was brutal. Maxentius held the larger army but was spread thin and disorganized. Constantine struck hard, driving his forces back to the Tiber. In the chaos, Maxentius was pushed off the bridge and drowned. Victory was Constantine's. Shortly afterward, in Mediolanum, modern Milan, Constantine met Licinius to solidify political and dynastic arrangements, producing the Edict of Milan. This agreement granted Licinius power over eastern Rome and left Constantine sole ruler of the West. More importantly, it extended religious tolerance to Christians and restored confiscated properties, yet harmony was short-lived. Though the edict promised tolerance, Licinius remained devoted to pagan traditions. Tensions escalated until 324 AD near Chrysopolis, where the 2 armies clashed. Constantine's military mastery prevailed. He pushed the eastern forces toward the sea, capturing or killing thousands. Licinius was defeated and executed. Constantine now ruled as sole emperor. He renamed Byzantium as Constantinople, anew, capital to mark his triumph. In 325 AD, he presided over the First Council of Nicaea, where over 300 bishops established the Nicene Creed, affirming Jesus Christ as begotten, not made, and of one substance with the Father. Only on his deathbed in 337 AD did Constantine receive baptism, sealing his place in history as Rome's first Christian emperor. By 370 AD, a new menace thundered across the steppes. The Huns, nomadic, ruthless, and raised to war from childhood. They mastered horsemanship as early as age 3. Legends claim they trained children to endure pain by striking them with swords. They swept over the Volga River, hungering for conquest. The Alans fell first, then the Ostrogoths in 370 AD, and by 376 they smashed the Visigoths, forcing them to seek asylum inside Roman borders. A new terror had arrived, the new barbarians whose speed and ferocity seemed unstoppable. By 395 AD, the Huns were raiding Roman domains. Many Roman Christians saw them as demons unleashed from hell. The death of Emperor Theodosius the Great removed the one man capable of containing them. His policy of splitting the empire between his sons Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west left Rome divided again. Theodosius was the last emperor of a united Rome, under the weak Honorius. The Western Empire became easy prey. The Visigoths, searching for a homeland, cast their eyes on Rome itself. Throughout the early 410s, Visigothic forces ransacked Roman towns. On August 24th for 10 AD, they entered and sacked the Eternal City. For the first time in nearly 800 years, a foreign army occupied Rome, yet the Visigoths could not hold the city, drifting on to pillage elsewhere until founding a kingdom in 418 AD in what is now Spain. Meanwhile, in the east, another storm gathered. Attila the Hun rose to power, earning the title Scourge of God for his devastating campaigns. After a failed peace attempt in 441, he swept through the Balkans and the Danubian frontier, a treaty. In 442, brought only a pause. In 443, Attila attacked again, ravaging the land up to Constantinople's massive walls. Even he could not breach them. Instead, he extracted tribute, an annual 2,100 pounds of gold, a staggering ransom for peace. By 451, the Huns invaded Gaul, forcing old enemies, Visigoths and Romans alike, to unite against them the night before the fateful clash. Legend says, a vision foreshadowed what was to come. Attila the Hun, sensing the weight of destiny, turned to ritual. He consulted the bones of sacrifices and foresaw disaster. Thousands of his own warriors would perish in the coming fight. The next day his premonition came true. On the Catalonian plains, one of the bloodiest battles of antiquity erupted. Hour after hour the fighting raged, until tens of thousands lay dead. For the first and only time, Attila tasted defeat. Yet even in loss, the Hun leader did not stop. He regrouped, marched south, and returned to Italy, burning and looting cities. Along the way, in 452, as Attila's armies closed in on Rome, an extraordinary meeting took place. Pope Leo I rode out to meet him, emissary of the Eternal City. No one knows exactly what was said, but legend claims that apparitions of Saints Peter and Paul stood by Leo, warning Attila to retreat or face divine wrath, whether frightened by visions, burdened by stretched supply lines, or weakened by malaria. Attila turned back. He withdrew to the Hungarian plain, leaving Rome standing but trembling, yet the Western Empire's agony was far from over. In 476 AD, a boy emperor named Romulus Augustulus sat on a crumbling throne. His legitimacy questioned, his authority hollow. He could not hold power. The Eastern Empire dispatched the Germanic general Odoacer and his mercenaries to suppress a revolt, but Odoacer saw a chance for himself. Instead of defending Rome, he deposed the young emperor, toppling the last vestige of Western imperial rule. The Western Roman Empire was dead. Odoacer was hailed as king of Italy, but his reign would not last. In 493 AD, Theodoric the Great of the Ostrogoths, backed by Eastern Emperor Zeno, marched into Italy. After a bloody struggle, he founded the Ostrogothic kingdom, sending Odoacer to his grave and closing the book on Rome's ancient order. As Europe descended into darkness, another land entered its golden dawn. In India, under the Gupta Empire, mathematics and astronomy flourished. Scholars like Brahmagupta pioneered the use of zero as a placeholder and solution in equations. Aryabhata measured the circumference of the Earth, proving it round long before the world accepted it, and developed methods to calculate pi and square roots. His crowning insight, the concept of the asymptote, defined the limit of curves without ever touching them, a leap that would echo across centuries. Meanwhile, the Franks under Clovis I clashed with the Alemanni, another fierce Germanic tribe. In 496 AD, at the Battle of Tolbiac, the Franks teetered on the edge of defeat. In desperation, Clovis called on the Christian god, promising conversion if granted victory. According to legend, a thunderstorm erupted, the Franks rallied, and their counterattack crushed the Alemanni. True to his word, Clovis embraced Christianity, cementing the faith at the heart of his kingdom and planting the seed of medieval Europe's first great Christian monarchy. While the Western Empire had fallen, the East endured and transformed. Many historians argue Constantinople's empire was still Rome, though under new banners. Under Emperor Justinian I, the Eastern Roman, or Byzantine, Empire entered a new age. Justinian reconquered lost territories, reclaiming Italy, North Africa, and parts of Spain. He ordered legal scholars to compile the Corpus Juris Civilis, the bedrock of modern European law. He commissioned the Hagia Sophia, a soaring cathedral of marble and mosaic that crowned Constantinople as the spiritual heart of Eastern Orthodoxy. But even as Byzantium rose, a new voice was beginning to speak from the sands of Arabia. In the city of Mecca, a boy named Muhammad was born into the Quraysh tribe. Orphaned young and raised by his grandfather and uncle, he became a merchant famed for honesty, earning the title Al-Amin, the trustworthy. In 610, on a retreat to Mount Jabal, Al-Nur, Muhammad experienced a revelation. The angel Gabriel appeared with words that would become the opening of the Quran. Recite in the name of your Lord who created man from a clot. Recite, for your Lord is most generous. Initially hesitant, Muhammad soon began to share the message. His following grew, mocked and resisted by the pagan leaders of Mecca, especially after he denounced idol worship. Persecution forced Muhammad and his followers to emigrate to Medina. There, he became not only a prophet but a statesman, ending civil wars and forging a thriving Muslim community. Yet the Quraysh were not finished. They marched to Medina with a great army. Muhammad devised a bold defense, a trench around the city. For weeks the enemy tried and failed to breach it. Storms and heavy rain broke their will, and they retreated. In 630 AD, Muhammad and his forces entered Mecca almost without bloodshed. He granted amnesty to his former enemies and dismantled idol worship. Islam swept across the city, uniting most of its population under one god. By the time Muhammad died, the Arabian Peninsula had been transformed into a single, unified Muslim realm, setting the stage for a new civilization that would shape the world. After the death of Prophet Muhammad, leadership of the Muslim community passed to his closest companion, Abu Bakr, the first caliph. Under his command, the young Islamic State began to stretch its reach far beyond Arabia, pushing into lands that had once seemed untouchable. The target: the Byzantine provinces of Syria. With precision and determination, Muslim forces captured Damascus, then Jerusalem, two of the most crucial strongholds of the Byzantine Empire. But the ambitions of the caliphs didn't end there. In 636, Arab armies swept east, clashing with the mighty Sasanian Empire. Just a year later, they marched into the Persian capital, sealing the fate of a dynasty that had ruled for centuries. The Sasanian Empire was no more. From Persia, the momentum carried them westward. Egypt became the next prize. After years of brutal fighting, Alexandria fell in 640 AD. This wasn't just another conquest, it struck at the very heart of Byzantine power, crippling their economy, and the expansion didn't stop. By the early 700s, Arab forces controlled North Africa, Carthage, and even pushed into Spain. By 716, their empire stretched astonishingly from the Atlantic coast of Lisbon all the way to the borders of China, but with great expansion came greater ambition. From the Iberian Peninsula, Muslim armies began pressing into the lands of the Franks, modern-day France. In 732, Emir Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi led a bold invasion northward, seizing cities like Bordeaux and Tours. Yet, destiny awaited on a battlefield. Near Tours, on October 10, 732, Frankish leader Charles Martel stood ready with a massive army. What followed was more than just a clash of soldiers, it was a battle of faiths, of worlds colliding. 4 days, the fighting raged. Casualties mounted on both sides, and then the tide turned. Charles Martel's forces broke the Arab advance. The once unstoppable expansion was halted, forcing the Muslim armies to retreat back into Spain. The western frontier of the Islamic Empire had reached its limit, but while Europe was drenched in the blood of holy wars, far to the east, China told a different story. Under the Tang dynasty, faiths coexisted in relative harmony. Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism all thrived side by side. Temples and pagodas rose across the empire, symbols of spiritual diversity. This was also the golden age of Chinese poetry. Writers like Li Po and Du Fu penned verses that would echo through history. In one hauntingly beautiful poem, Li Po reflects, "The birds have vanished down the sky. Now the last cloud drains away. We sit together, the mountain and me until only the mountain remains." Meanwhile, in the west, a new power was rising. In 768, Charlemagne Charles the Great took the throne of the Franks. A brilliant commander, he carved out an empire across much of Western Europe, France, Germany, Italy, Spain. But his sword was guided by faith. A devout Christian, Charlemagne sought not just to expand borders, but to spread Christianity itself. And, as the West forged its destiny in the East, a new caliph Harun was about to rise. While many rulers sought glory through conquest, one caliph took a different path. Harun al-Rashid, instead of waging wars, turned his gaze toward knowledge. In Baghdad, the new capital of the Abbasid Empire, he laid the foundation for what would become legendary. The House of Wisdom. This wasn't just a library. It was a magnet for the brightest minds of the age. Scholars from distant lands gathered to translate the works of ancient civilizations, and in the process, they advanced entirely new sciences: algebra, chemistry, sociology. Even the mind-bending concept of infinity itself. Baghdad became the beating heart of human knowledge, but far to the north, another people defined progress in their own way. The Vikings, unlike the scholars of Baghdad, these seafaring pagans from Scandinavia craved not wisdom but wealth. And on June 8, 793, they shocked Europe with a strike that echoed for centuries. Their longships landed on Lindisfarne, a small island off England's coast, home to a monastery renowned as one of Europe's greatest centers of learning. What followed was pure devastation. Monks were slaughtered, sacred relics looted, survivors enslaved. The attack on Lindisfarne marked the dawn of the Viking Age. And Europe trembled. Even Rome wasn't safe from turmoil. In 799, Pope Leo III was attacked by rivals accusing him of tyranny. Fleeing to the Frankish kingdom, he sought the protection of Charlemagne. With Frankish steel behind him, the Pope was restored to power. And in gratitude, on Christmas Day of the year 800, in the Grand Basilica of St. Peter, he placed a crown upon Charlemagne's head. Thus, the Holy Roman Empire was born, or at least its first incarnation. Under Charlemagne, Europe seemed to be entering a golden age. But after his death in 814, cracks spread quickly. His successor, Louis the Pious, inherited not only the empire but its burdens. A devout Catholic, yes, but weak in leadership. And as Viking raids ravaged cities along the Rhine-Cologne, Trier, Mainz, faith in the empire's strength crumbled. With central authority faltering, local lords rose to power, offering protection in exchange for loyalty. It was the birth of European feudalism, a system where safety came at the cost of freedom. Meanwhile, Arab raiders pressed forward in the Mediterranean. In the 820s, they seized Crete, then Sicily, then Sardinia, tightening their grip on vital trade routes. The balance of power was shifting on every front, and when Louis the Pious died in 840, so too did Charlemagne's empire. Internal rivalries tore it apart, formalized in the Treaty of Verdun. His grandsons divided the empire. Charles the Bald took the West France, Louis the German, the East Germany. And Lothair, the fragile middle, a kingdom doomed by geography, but the Viking storm had not passed. England was battered relentlessly until 871, when Alfred the Great of Wessex rose to defend his people. He built fortified towns, crafted new military strategies, and united other Anglo-Saxon rulers. Through his vision, Wessex survived. Across the sea, the story was different. In Russia, tribes weary of chaos invited Viking leaders, the Varangians, to bring order. Rurik and his brothers established rule in Novgorod, giving birth to the Kievan Rus. Under Oleg, they expanded to Smolensk and Kiev, laying the foundation of Russia itself. Back in England, Alfred's legacy lived on. His grandson Athelstan united the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, defeating Viking threats and earning the title of the first true king of England. A monarchy that would endure for centuries had begun. In Central Europe, a new threat loomed: the pagan Magyars. They swept across the East Frankish kingdom, spreading terror. But in 955, King Otto crushed them at the Battle of Lechfeld. With his victory, he secured the empire's strength and, by 962, was crowned Holy Roman Emperor in Rome, restoring a vision of Christian unity. France, however, faltered. In 987, the last Carolingian king, Louis V, died without an heir. The monarchy stood on the edge of collapse. But the nobles chose Hugh Capet, supported by the church, as the first king of France, ushering in the Capetian dynasty. Yet for the common people of Europe, life remained bleak. Kingdoms rose and fell, crowns were won and lost, but for the peasants, the pattern was the same: fear, hunger, and endless toil. Feudalism spread like wildfire, binding them to their lords in a world where survival meant surrendering freedom. In medieval Europe, society was built like a pyramid. At its base stood the serfs, peasants bound to the land, working tirelessly to feed everyone above them. Next came the knights, warriors sworn to defend both people and faith. Above them were the nobles, lords of vast territories who held power through land ownership. Then came the kings, rulers who granted that land in return for loyalty, but at the very top sat not a king, but the Pope, believed to hold divine authority, the only man who could speak directly to God and therefore the rightful owner of all lands on earth. Yet, while Europe's hierarchy was set in stone, the world beyond held mysteries waiting to be uncovered. In the early 11th century, a Norse explorer named Leif Erikson set sail westward from Greenland, his destination unknown. But his journey would lead him across the Atlantic to a new world, Vinland, today known as Newfoundland, Canada. There, Leif and his crew built a settlement, trading with the indigenous peoples and surviving a harsh winter in a land rich with timber, fish, and game. When they returned to Greenland, they were hailed as heroes, unaware they had stumbled upon a vast new continent. Centuries before Columbus would do the same, but while Leif's voyage hinted at new horizons, the Americas remained largely a mystery. What we do know is that civilizations like the Maya thrived, building monumental cities such as Tikal, Palenque, and Chichen Itza, home to millions. To the north, tribes like the Cherokee, Navajo, and Inuits carved out their own worlds. The Inuits, living closest to the icy coasts, may have even crossed paths with Leif's Viking explorers. Back in Europe, faith itself was under attack. In Jerusalem stood the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, built on the site where Christians believed Jesus was crucified and resurrected, but in the year 1009, Arab Caliph al-Hakim ordered its destruction, reducing the sacred site to rubble. The news sent shockwaves across Christendom. Outrage grew, and Pope Sergius IV called for a holy struggle to reclaim the Holy Land. Yet, before European crusaders could march east, the Muslim world itself shifted. The Seljuk Turks, a rising power from Central Asia, stormed into Baghdad in 1055, seizing the Abbasid capital. Over the following decades, they extended their grip over Islam's holiest cities, Medina in 1076 and Mecca soon after. By the time Pope Urban II spoke at the Council of Clermont in 1095, the stage was set. He urged Christians to take up arms. Promising forgiveness of sins and eternal reward, his words ignited a fire across Europe. Nobles, knights, even peasants rallied to his call. Leaders like Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, Bohemond of Taranto, and Robert of Flanders gathered their armies and marched toward the Holy Land. Divided and unprepared, Muslim defenders could not withstand the wave of crusaders. In 1098, the Christians seized Edessa, and a year later, in 1099, Jerusalem itself fell. A holy city soaked in blood was now under Crusader control, but the story of the Crusades had only just begun. In 1144, the Muslim commanders Engi launched a fierce siege of Edessa. After weeks of resistance, the city crumbled, its inhabitants slaughtered or enslaved. Europe was outraged. So, in 1147, the Second Crusade was born. Massive armies marched east once again, but this time, fate was not on their side. Strangled by supply shortages, crippled by infighting, and betrayed by political rivalries, the campaign collapsed. By 1149, after the crushing defeat at the Battle of Anab and the capture of King Louis VII, the Crusader dream was in ruins. While Christians and Muslims clashed in the Holy Land, far across the world the Khmer Empire under the powerful King Suryavarman II raised one of the greatest monuments in human history, Angkor Wat, a breathtaking temple dedicated to the Hindu god Vishnu. Vishnu, the preserver of the universe, revered for his 10 divine incarnations, was depicted with serene blue skin, for hands holding sacred objects, and a presence that symbolized balance in a world of chaos. As travelers approached Angkor Wat for the first time, they would find themselves confronted not just by stone, but by a vision, an enormous moat stretching into the horizon, and a gateway carved with mythical beasts and celestial beings, as if warning visitors that they were stepping into the realm of gods. Rising at the heart of this sacred city, the temple itself soared like a man-made mountain, its walls alive with stories carved into stone, great battles, heavenly ceremonies, and the daily struggles of a civilization determined to leave its mark on eternity. At its core, a sanctuary towered above courtyards and shrines, the most sacred space of all, where divine figures seemed almost to breathe through the intricate carvings. It was more than architecture, it was human ambition, turned into a sacred landscape. But even as Angkor Wat was being raised, another storm was brewing far to the west. In 1187, Saladin, the indomitable commander from Egypt, grew weary of Christian rule over Jerusalem. Declaring a holy war, he rallied the Muslim world to reclaim the sacred city. On a blistering summer day near the Sea of Galilee, 20,000 of his soldiers faced a smaller Christian army of just 12,000, led by King Guy. At first, small skirmishes broke out, but soon the earth trembled under a full-scale battle. Saladin's cavalry, swift and merciless, surrounded the Crusaders, who found themselves trapped, choking on dust and thirst, the searing heat burning away their strength. As exhaustion set in, the Muslim forces struck with relentless fury. Knights were captured, soldiers cut down. King Guy himself barely escaped, but his army was annihilated. That single defeat opened the path for Saladin to reclaim Jerusalem, a blow so devastating it shook Christendom to its core. But the Christians would not simply accept defeat. They vowed revenge. What followed became one of the most ambitious military campaigns in history, the Third Crusade. 3 monarchs, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick I, King Richard the Lionheart of England, and King Philip II of France sent vast armies across continents, the world's most powerful rulers, united under a single cause, to tear Jerusalem back from Saladin's grip. Yet, despite all their might, their crusade ended in failure. Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands. Meanwhile, far across the steppes of Asia, a child was born whose destiny would alter the course of history more than any crusade. His name was Temujin, but the world would come to know him as Genghis Khan. Born under violent circumstances, his mother abducted, his father poisoned. Legend said he entered the world clutching a blood clot, a dark omen of the rivers of blood he would one day spill. Before he was 10, his family was abandoned by their clan, left to starve in the harsh Mongolian wilderness. Yet from despair he forged strength. Slowly, he gathered allies among scattered tribes. By 1206, he had united 1 million people under his banner, transforming feuding clans into an unstoppable nation. Though ruthless in war, Genghis shocked the medieval world with progressive laws, forbidding the sale of women, outlawing slavery among Mongols, even granting freedom of religion. But when the time came for conquest, he unleashed terror without restraint. In 1209, his cavalry thundered into the Xizia kingdom, obliterating it. By 1211, he turned his fury on the Jin dynasty of China. For 3 brutal years, his outnumbered horsemen ravaged the countryside, driving the Jin rulers to kill their own peasants just to preserve food for their nobles. In 1214, Beijing itself, then called Dadu, was besieged and burned, and yet, while Genghis' empire expanded in the east, Europe itself was undergoing a revolution in thought. King John of England, forced to bend to his barons, signed the Magna Carta in 1215, a document that demanded the king respect rights he had long trampled. Ideas like fair trials, due process, and habeas corpus were carved into law seeds of principles that still shape governments centuries later. But just as Europe dreamed of liberty, it also sank once more into holy war. In 1217, the Crusaders marched again, capturing Damietta in Egypt. Victory seemed near, but hubris led to disaster. Starved, captured, and beaten, the survivors limped home, defeated once more. For Genghis Khan, failure was never an option. In 1219, he unleashed his horde on the Khwarezmian Empire, covering modern-day Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, and Iran. Cities like Bukhara and Samarkand fell in waves of fire and steel. Craftsmen were spared to fuel his empire's growth, but nobles and soldiers were slaughtered. Ordinary peasants were forced to march before Mongol armies as human shields. Terror itself became a weapon. No one knows how many millions perished in his wars, but the scale was so vast that today nearly 8% of men in parts of Asia can trace their lineage back to him. By the mid-13th century, the world was aflame with crusades, conquests, and upheavals. Emperor Frederick II failed to seize the Holy Land. King Louis IX of France launched two crusades, captured, ransomed, and eventually killed by dysentery on foreign soil. His death marked the end of crusading fervor. Meanwhile, in England, King Edward I summoned one of the first true parliaments, a political experiment that would echo into the modern age. Far south, across the sands of Africa, Mansa Musa of Mali rose in glory. On his pilgrimage to Mecca, he gave away so much gold that entire economies collapsed under the weight of his generosity. Returning home, he turned Timbuktu into a beacon of knowledge, funding scholars, universities, and mosques. His devotion to Islam and his wealth left a legacy so extraordinary that tales of his riches still astound the world. And across the ocean, in the Americas, the Aztecs were building a city born of prophecy. Guided by the vision of an eagle perched upon a cactus, devouring a snake, they founded Tenochtitlan in the waters of Lake Texcoco. With grand temples, ingenious canals, and floating gardens, the city became one of the most remarkable urban centers of its age, but glory and ambition did not protect humanity from nature's wrath. In 1347, the Black Death swept across Europe, carried by rats on ships, decimating entire populations. Swellings grew in the groin and armpits, black boils that foretold certain death. Within a few years, between 75 and 200 million souls had perished, and yet, in the ashes of so much death, change was born. Survivors demanded rights. Nobles were forced to yield power. The old world was crumbling, and a new one was emerging. In China, rebellion tore through Mongol rule. The Red Turbans rose under the leadership of Zhu Yuanzhang, a peasant-turned-general. In 1368, he declared himself emperor, founding the Ming dynasty and marking the dawn of a new era. Meanwhile, in Europe, a teenage girl named Joan of Arc rose from obscurity. Guided by visions, she convinced Charles VII to give her command of an army. Against all odds, she broke the siege of Orleans in 1429, inspiring a nation. But her victories earned her enemies as well. Captured, tried for heresy, and accused of witchcraft, Joan was burned at the stake at just 19 years old. 2 decades later, France would drive out the English, closing the chapter on the 100 Years' War. And even as France rose, Constantinople was falling. The Byzantine Empire, battered by centuries of decline, now faced a rising power, the Ottomans, led by a young and ruthless sultan named Mehmed II. The stage was set for the clash that would mark the true end of the medieval world. In the year 1453, the world held its breath as one of history's most dramatic sieges unfolded. Mehmed II, the young and ambitious Sultan of the Ottomans, gathered an army of nearly 80,000 soldiers. Among them were his elite Janissaries, disciplined warriors raised from childhood to fight for the empire, and a terrifying new weapon, heavy artillery capable of shaking ancient stone to rubble. Their target was nothing less than the legendary city of Constantinople, the last bastion of the Byzantine Empire, ruled by Emperor Constantine XI. The Byzantines were outnumbered, outgunned, and nearly alone, yet they stood on the walls of a city that had withstood centuries of sieges, clinging to the hope that the great fortifications of Constantinople could resist even the mightiest army of the age. For nearly 2 relentless months, Ottoman cannons pounded the walls day and night, sending thunderous echoes across land and sea. Inside the city, food ran scarce, morale frayed, but the defenders refused to surrender. Then came May 29, 1453, the day the world changed, with siege towers rolling forward and waves of soldiers surging toward the battered defenses. The Ottomans broke through. The defenders fought with desperate courage, but the flood could not be stopped. Constantine XI himself is said to have cast aside his imperial robes and fought to the death among his men. By nightfall, Constantinople was in Ottoman hands. The Byzantine Empire, the final thread to the glory of ancient Rome, was gone. What followed was not just the fall of a city, but the birth of a new era. The Ottomans dominated the Mediterranean, their crescent banner replacing the eagle of Caesar. For the first time in 1,000 years, the map of the world was redrawn, but while Byzantium collapsed, another power was stirring in the north. Russia, long under the shadow of Mongol domination, was ready to rise. For decades, Russian cities had been forced to pay tribute to the Mongols, living in fear of destruction if they resisted. Yet in 1472, Ivan III, known to history as Ivan the Great, refused. He strengthened his armies, pushed back the garrisons, and declared independence. By 1480, in a tense standoff along the Ugra River, the Mongols demanded submission. Ivan held his ground. At last, the Mongols withdrew. It was a turning point, the dawn of a free Russia and the slow decline of the Mongol Empire that had once terrified half the world. Meanwhile, on the edge of the Atlantic, sails appeared on the horizon. In 1492, Christopher Columbus set out to find a new route to India. Instead, he stumbled upon an island in the Bahamas, San Salvador. The Lucans who lived there welcomed him warmly, offering food and gifts, unaware of how this moment would alter their destiny forever. Europe had discovered the New World, and nothing would ever be the same. Back in Europe, however, a cultural revolution was flourishing. In Florence, Leonardo da Vinci painted the Mona Lisa, a portrait whose enigmatic smile has haunted humanity for centuries. Leonardo's mastery of anatomy, optics, and light gave her face a realism both scientific and divine. Around the same time, Michelangelo carved David from marble, insisting he merely freed the figure already hidden within the stone. Soon after, he painted the Sistine Chapel, filling its ceiling with visions of God and man that seemed to tear open the heavens themselves, and while artists immortalized beauty, politics explored power. In 1513, Niccolò Machiavelli wrote The Prince, a work that shook the foundations of leadership. "It is safer to be feared than loved," he wrote, reminding rulers that obligation fades but fear endures. His words reflected the brutal reality of the age. Farmers toiled under crushing taxes not because they adored their lords, but because fear kept them obedient. Without their leaders' armies, the Mongols or Huns might sweep in and destroy everything. Fear, not love, held society together, but not everyone accepted the old order. In 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther defied the most powerful institution of his time, the Catholic Church. Outraged by the selling of indulgences papers that claimed to shorten one's suffering in purgatory, Luther declared the practice corrupt and unholy. With hammer and nail, he posted his 95 Theses on the door of the castle church in Wittenberg, igniting debate across Europe. To some, he was a prophet, to others, a heretic. But there was no turning back the Protestant. Reformation had begun even as faith fractured Europe, steel and blood reshaped the Americas. In 1519, Hernancourts landed on Aztec shores. The Aztecs, believing him to be a divine messenger, showered him with gold. But Court's ambitions were far from holy. With guns, cannons, and alliances with local enemies of the Aztecs, his small force waged war on an empire of millions. After years of battle and months of siege, Tenochtitlan, the jewel of the Aztec world, fell in 1521. The Aztec Empire was gone, and the Spanish appetite did not stop there. Following Court's ruthless path, Francisco Pizarro marched into the Inca Empire of Peru. Superior weaponry and deadly ambition tore through the Andes, but perhaps the most devastating weapon was invisible disease. Smallpox, measles, and plague spread from European bodies to native populations who had no immunity. Whole civilizations crumbled before the conquerors even arrived. Across the Mediterranean, another empire was rising to heights of glory. Under Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottoman Empire stretched from Europe to Arabia, Persia to North Africa. Suleiman captured Belgrade, Jerusalem, Baghdad. His empire's reach seemed limitless. His navy ruled the seas, his armies dominated the land. The Ottomans stood at the center of the known world, unmatched in power, but as empires rose, love and ambition toppled kings. In England, Henry VIII became obsessed with Anne Boleyn, desperate to make her his queen. The Catholic Church forbade his divorce from Catherine of Aragon. So Henry tore England away from Rome, declaring himself head of the Church of England in 1534. The break would divide Christianity and England for centuries, leaving a scar that still shapes history. When Ivan IV, remembered to history as Ivan the Terrible, rose to power as ruler of Russia, his reign began with the promise of glory. In those early years, he directed military campaigns with relentless energy, pushing the borders of Russia outward against neighboring kingdoms and tribes. Each conquest seemed to confirm that Russia's destiny was tied to expansion, that its strength was in its ability to stretch further into lands that had never before been under Moscow's rule. At the same time, Ivan sought to showcase the grandeur of his growing empire through monumental works. Among the most enduring symbols of his reign was the breathtaking St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow, a masterpiece whose vibrant domes and soaring architecture announced to the world that Russia was no longer a fragmented land of princes, but a rising power to be reckoned with. For a moment, it seemed as though Ivan might truly usher in a golden age, but history rarely grants glory without shadows. As the years passed, Ivan's mind became consumed by doubt, suspicion, and fear. Whispers of betrayal haunted him. He began to see enemies not just beyond Russia's borders, but within his own court. Nobles, advisors, even those who once pledged absolute loyalty, none were safe from his wrath. His reign turned darker, marked by purges that left rivers of blood flowing. Through the streets, men were executed for imagined crimes, entire families wiped out on the suspicion of disloyalty. The same ruler who built cathedrals of wonder now built a kingdom of terror. Ivan's paranoia was matched only by his fury. His temper was infamous, explosive, unpredictable, and merciless. Those who dared to challenge him, even with words of caution or reason, were struck down in fits of violent rage. His court, once a place of counsel and governance, transformed into a theater of fear where every glance and every word could spell doom. Then, in 1560, tragedy struck at the very heart of the Tsar. Anastasia, his beloved wife and closest source of comfort, suddenly died. To the world, it was the passing of a queen. But to Ivan, it was a wound that never healed. Her death shattered whatever remained of his stability. Consumed with grief, he believed her end was not natural but the result of poison, a sinister plot woven by the same nobles he had long distrusted. Whether or not this was true, Ivan's suspicions hardened into unrelenting vengeance. The personal loss of his wife became the fuel for an even greater storm of brutality, one that would forever brand him as a ruler both feared and reviled. For in that moment, Russia was not just ruled by its Tsar, it was ruled by a man whose love had been ripped away, leaving only rage in its place. And as history would soon reveal, Ivan's wrath would not stop at his enemies. It would consume his nation, shaping Russia's destiny for generations to come. The death of Anastasia marked more than just the loss of a queen, it marked the unraveling of a man. Ivan IV, already feared by many, seemed to break apart under the weight of grief. What followed was a transformation so chilling that history remembers him not only as a Tsar but as Ivan the Terrible. His paranoia turned inward, and Russia itself became his battlefield. He unleashed a reign of terror that scarred his own nation, the infamous Oprichnina. Clad in black, his personal guard swept across the land like a shadow, burning villages, confiscating property, and executing thousands under the slightest suspicion of betrayal. Families were destroyed, cities emptied, and a wave of fear washed across the Russian people. It was not an enemy at the borders they feared most, it was their own ruler. And yet, in this darkness, Russia itself was being forged into the brutal, unyielding state it would one day become. Across the Channel, while Russia descended into terror, England was beginning to rise into an age of extraordinary creativity. Queen Elizabeth I sat on the throne, and the English Renaissance blossomed around her. Playwrights filled the theaters with words that seemed to breathe with life itself. Among them, William Shakespeare towered above the rest. His plays did not merely entertain, they dissected power, ambition, and the fragility of the human condition. Julius Caesar, a story of betrayal and the lust for control, reminded audiences of the same timeless struggles that shaped their own world. King John captured the brutal realities of war and sovereignty, while Henry VIII turned the lens on the human need to grasp at authority no matter the cost. Alongside Shakespeare, figures like Christopher Marlowe, Ben Jonson, and John Webster added their voices, each play a reflection of human ambition, weakness, and wonder. The stage became a mirror, reflecting truths too dangerous to speak outright, truths that still resonate centuries later, but the Elizabethan world was not confined to words. It was also about voyages, conquest, and the dream of new lands, too. The West, the English carved a fragile foothold in the New World with Jamestown, Virginia, a settlement that would grow into the heart of America's story. Further north, French explorer Samuel de Champlain established Quebec, planting the seeds of a French empire in Canada. The New World was no longer a distant horizon. It was a battlefield of empires, a place where cultures collided and destinies clashed. Meanwhile, Europe itself was tearing apart from within. In 1618, the spark of rebellion in Bohemia ignited a firestorm that became one of the bloodiest conflicts in European history, the 30 Years' War. It began as a struggle of faith, as the Holy Roman Emperor sought to impose Catholicism on his Protestant subjects. But soon it spiraled into something far larger, a war of religion, of politics, of ambition. Protestants and Catholics alike unleashed armies upon each other, but behind the banners of faith were the ambitions of kings and princes. For 3 decades, Europe bled. Villages were starved, cities burned, and both sides committed atrocities that seemed without end. France, Spain, Sweden, and countless German states became entangled in a conflict that seemed to devour everything it touched. By the time the Peace of Westphalia was signed in 1648, the landscape of Europe had been remade. The treaty recognized the independence of the Dutch Republic, reshaped borders, and, most importantly, cemented the principle of state sovereignty. It was not just a treaty, it was the beginning of the modern world. Far to the east, another empire was crumbling. The Ming dynasty in China, once a beacon of order and majesty, was collapsing under the weight of corruption and factional strife. Emperor Chongzhen sat in Beijing surrounded by advisors who quarreled and schemed while the empire's enemies gathered strength. Resources dwindled, armies weakened, and the Manchu threat grew ever more ominous. In 1644, the Manchu prince Dorgan led his disciplined forces against the decayed Ming state. The Ming armies, hollowed by years of neglect, could not withstand them. Beijing fell, the Ming emperor took his own life, and the dynasty was swept aside. The cycle of Chinese history turned once more as the Qing dynasty rose from the ashes. Claiming the mandate of Heaven. And in Europe, the question of succession ignited yet another storm. When Spain's King Charles II died childless, the great powers of Europe saw not just a vacant throne, but a chance to reshape the balance of the continent. Louis XIV of France pressed for his grandson Philip to take the Spanish crown, hoping to bind Spain's vast empire to France's destiny. Austria and Britain, unwilling to see French dominance, rallied behind Archduke Charles of the Habsburg line. The continent once again fell into chaos. Armies marched, alliances shifted, and the War of Spanish Succession raged. By the time the Treaty of Utrecht was signed in 1713, Philip was recognized as King of Spain, but at a price. He renounced any claim to the French throne, ensuring that Europe would remain divided, a balance of power maintained only by blood. The early 18th century brought yet another seismic change, the union of England and Scotland. In 1707, the Acts of Union bound the two kingdoms into one entity, Great Britain. But not all Scots accepted this marriage of crowns. Protests erupted and rebellions surged in the Jacobite risings of 1715 and 1745, where men raised banners to restore their monarch and reclaim independence. Though the risings failed, they burned into memory a vision of Scotland that refused to fade, and then, across the ocean, a new world was about to speak with its own voice. On July 4, 1776, in a modest hall in Philadelphia, a group of men placed their signatures on a document that would shake the foundations of empire. "We hold these truths to be self-evident," it declared, "that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." These words were not just ink on parchment, they were a spark, a promise, a declaration that the old order of kings and empires could be challenged. From the terror of Ivan in Russia to the soaring words of Jefferson in America, history had turned a page. And nothing would ever be the same again. Liberty and the pursuit of happiness. With these words, the war in the Americas was truly on, but back in Europe, the atmosphere could not have been more different. Adam Smith had just published his groundbreaking book, The Wealth of Nations, laying the foundations of laissez-faire economics, a radical new idea that claimed the market, if left alone, would always balance itself out over time. At the same moment in Austria, Mozart was performing his magnum opus, the Hafner Serenade. Its graceful melodies, elegant harmonies, and refined courtly dances swept across Europe, a reminder that while the world was tearing itself apart with war, beauty and genius were still being created. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, King George III poured armies of red-coated soldiers into America. But the colonists, though poorly trained, had one massive advantage: they knew the terrain. They fought with guerrilla tactics, striking from the shadows. While the British uniforms made them easy targets, the war came to its decisive climax in the summer of 1781, when George Washington and French General Rochambeau led their forces south to Virginia. At Yorktown, British General Cornwallis found himself trapped by land and by sea. The French Navy shattered Britain's last hope of escape in a crucial naval battle, while American and French forces dug trenches, launched artillery bombardments, and slowly crushed the British defenses. Then came October 14, 1781, a massive Allied assault broke through the lines, and just 5 days later, Cornwallis surrendered. The impossible had happened. The mighty British Empire had been defeated by a band of colonists. The victory at Yorktown didn't just end a war, it ended British rule in America and marked the birth of a new experiment, a nation founded on freedom. But freedom came with a question: how should this new nation be led? Many wanted to crown George Washington as king, but instead democracy was chosen. Yet, even the ancients had warned of its flaws. Plato himself argued that the common man was too unwise to pick the best leader. To balance freedom with stability, America created the Electoral College, a system where the people voted, but the final say went to a select group of elites who would formally choose the president. The world was watching, and in France, they noticed at the time King Louis XVI and his queen, Marie Antoinette, ruled a starving nation. When peasants begged for bread, legend has it the queen replied with a single cold phrase, "Let them eat cake," but the people of France had seen what the Americans had achieved, and they wanted their own revolution. They formed the National Assembly, drafted new laws, and demanded rights that kings had denied them for centuries. The spark became a wildfire on July 14, 1789, with the storming of the Bastille, a prison that symbolized royal power. By tearing it down, the people sent a message to the world: they would no longer bow to a tyrant. From there, the revolution spiraled, the monarchy crumbled, and the guillotine became its symbol. King Louis XVI was executed soon after. Queen Marie Antoinette followed. The old order of kings and queens was falling apart, and a new age of people's power had begun. The streets of France trembled with chants of revolution, and in the midst of the chaos, one man rose to embody both hope and terror: Maximilien Robespierre. In 1789, as France's monarchy crumbled under financial disaster, Robespierre stepped onto the stage of history as a delegate to the Estates General. To some, he was a beacon of justice, a voice unafraid to demand equality for the ordinary citizen, the forgotten poor who had suffered for centuries under the crushing weight of aristocracy. To others, he was a dangerous radical, ready to tear apart the fabric of society, and in that tension, the revolution marched forward. But revolutions have a way of devouring their children. Robespierre quickly evolved from idealist reformer to ruthless enforcer, pushing for the trial and eventual execution of King Louis XVI. The monarchy was dead, and with its death came the birth of a republic drenched in suspicion and fear. By 1793, Robespierre had secured a seat on the infamous Committee of Public Safety, a name that promised order but delivered the blood-stained chapter we remember as the Reign of Terror. Thousands of men and women were dragged to makeshift trials, branded enemies of the revolution, and sent to meet the cold steel of the guillotine. The revolution, meant to liberate, became a machine of death, and yet power is fickle. The very man who wielded terror so uncompromisingly would soon find himself in its grip. By 1794, the French people, exhausted by violence and instability, turned on Robespierre. He was arrested, imprisoned, and on July 28th, he too was marched to the guillotine. The blade that had silenced so many now silenced him. With his death, the revolution shifted once again. Democracy was abandoned, replaced by a fragile experiment known as the Directory, a 5-member council designed to balance competing factions. But balance is a dream in a nation addicted to upheaval. The Directory faltered, and into the vacuum stepped a man whose name still echoes across continents: Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon was not a man of compromise, he was a man of conquest. By 1805, he had shattered the might of Austria and Russia at the Battle of Austerlitz, crowning himself as one of Europe's most dominant figures. He rolled across the map like a storm, sweeping into Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, his ambition limitless, his armies unstoppable. But power invites overreach. In 1812, Napoleon made the fateful decision to invade Russia. He marched in with one of the largest armies Europe had ever seen. But no army is greater than winter, the bitter cold, the endless expanse, the scorched earth left behind by retreating Russians. It broke his forces, starving them, freezing them, leaving corpses scattered across the snow. The mighty emperor staggered back to France, diminished. His legend cracked, the end came swiftly. In 1814, Allied powers united against him, forcing his abdication and exile to the island of Elba, yet Napoleon was not a man to fade quietly. He returned in 1815, the 100 days of his final gamble. For a moment, France roared with his return. But at Waterloo, facing the combined might of Britain and Prussia, the great conqueror fell at last. From there, his destiny was sealed in exile, this time on the remote island of St. Helena, far from the continent he once dominated. But while Napoleon's shadow loomed over Europe, across the Atlantic a very different kind of liberation was unfolding. A man named Simon Bolivar, often called El Libertador, was leading Latin America in a fiery struggle against Spanish colonial rule. Beginning in Venezuela in 1810, Bolivar inspired uprisings that spread like wildfire. His victories in Colombia, including the pivotal Battle of Boyaca in 1819, broke the Spanish hold on the region. He marched onward to Ecuador and Peru, delivering blows that shattered imperial control. By 1824, with the capture of Lima, Spanish rule in South America crumbled. And in 1825, in a final act of triumph, Bolivia was named in his honor, a nation baptized in the legacy of one man's relentless pursuit of freedom. But even as nations were being born, new ideas were being forged that threatened to reshape the entire world order. In 1848, two men, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, dared to imagine a future without kings, without emperors, without even capitalists. Their book, The Communist Manifesto, questioned the very foundations of society. What if the workers, the proletariat, seized control of the means of production? What if power belonged not to the wealthy few, but to the collective many? It was a vision of equality, but also a vision that terrified the established world. Their words would ignite debates, inspire revolutions, and leave scars that stretched far beyond the 19th century. And so the age marched forward, revolutions burning hot, empires collapsing, ideas spreading faster than gunpowder. At every turn, the world asked itself, who holds the right to rule? And at every turn, history answered with blood, brilliance, and the unstoppable hunger for change. Let the ruling classes tremble at a communistic revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains, and a world to win. With those words, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels didn't just publish the Communist Manifesto in 1848, they lit a match that threatened to set the old order ablaze. Their vision was unapologetic, their rhetoric fierce. They claimed that the bourgeoisie, forever hungry for markets and profit, was doomed to chase expansion across the globe, to nestle everywhere, to settle everywhere, to plant flags where they had no rightful claim. And as if on cue, Europe turned its eyes toward Africa. The scramble for Africa was not a noble adventure. It was a cold, calculated rush for land and power. By the 1870s, European explorers pushed deeper into the heart of the continent, not with respect but with maps and contracts. Missionaries preached, diplomats schemed, and soldiers followed, their rifles and cannons enforcing the will of distant monarchs and parliaments. At first, it was exploration, but soon it became domination. Borders were slashed across the map by men in European capitals who had never set foot on African soil. Entire nations were carved into fragments, tribes divided, rivalries stoked, languages mixed and manipulated, all to keep Africa weak and Europe strong. It was colonization at its most ruthless, and its scars remain to this day. But history is a pendulum. By the early 20th century, Europe's hunger for colonies waned, replaced by something far more dangerous: suspicion of one another. Industrial might had turned into arms races. Diplomatic rivalries hardened into military alliances. The powder keg was ready, and in 1914, one spark set it all off. June 28, Sarajevo. A gunshot echoed through the streets, but its sound reverberated across the entire world. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was assassinated by a young Serbian nationalist, Gavrilo Princip. It was an act meant to strike a blow for independence, but instead it unleashed a storm. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, Germany declared war on Russia. Then on France, Britain joined in to defend Belgium. Within weeks, Europe was no longer debating. It was burning. World War I had begun, a war of trenches, gas, and attrition. For 4 long years, men lived in mud, shells screamed overhead, and nations bled themselves dry. And then, in November 1918, at the 11th hour on the 11th day, silence fell. An armistice was signed, the Ottoman Empire crumbled, and millions were left to wonder what had been gained in exchange for so much death, but peace would not last. In fact, the end of World War I laid the foundations for an even darker storm. Out of the ashes rose Adolf Hitler. He studied the conquerors of old, Alexander, Caesar, Genghis Khan, Napoleon, and envisioned something greater. He didn't just want an empire, he wanted the empire, one so vast it would make Rome look like a footnote in history. His obsession wasn't just power, it was control, domination, and the ruthless extermination of those he deemed unworthy of life, the world. Watched in horror as Nazi Germany expanded across Europe, swallowing nations whole, enslaving millions. But by 1945, the tide had turned. In April, Soviet forces stormed Berlin, street by street, block by block, as Allied armies pressed in from the west. Hitler's dream crumbled into rubble. On May 2nd, Berlin fell. By May 7th, Germany signed unconditional surrender. The war in Europe was over, yet the war itself still raged across the Pacific. In August 1945, the sky above Hiroshima erupted into blinding light, followed days later by Nagasaki. Atomic fire ended what years of bloodshed could not. Japan surrendered, and World War II closed, not with a handshake, but with a weapon. That changed humanity forever. From that moment, the world was reborn into a new kind of struggle. Technology leapt forward. Alan Turing's wartime invention of the computer cracked codes and opened the door to an entirely new era. The planet was shrinking, connected in ways never imagined before. And yet, as nations healed to superpowers, emerged, staring each other down across oceans and continents, the United States and the Soviet Union, allies turned rivals, locked in a Cold War that stretched across half a century. Not a war of direct battles, but of ideology, espionage, nuclear threats, and the relentless question whose vision of the future would prevail. The story of humanity had entered a new chapter, not defined by empires rising and falling on horseback, but by machines, ideologies, and the terrifying possibility of total annihilation. The story of our century is still being written. The world had survived the deadliest war in history, but peace was never real. A new conflict was already beginning, one colder, quieter, and armed with weapons that could wipe out humanity. In seconds, in 1945, two giants emerged from the rubble of World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union, democracy versus communism, capitalism versus revolution. The planet itself split into nuclear weapons defined the era. Each bomb tested was not just a show of strength, it was a reminder that civilization was living on borrowed time. Spies traded secrets in dark alleys, propaganda flooded every screen and newspaper, and nations across the world were forced to choose sides. From Berlin to Korea, from Washington to Moscow, the Cold War became the stage on which the future of humanity was at stake. It wasn't just about territory, it was about ideas, and the terrifying possibility that one miscalculation could ignite the end of the world. But when Earth itself wasn't enough for this rivalry, both superpowers set their eyes on the heavens. The Cold War was about to leave the ground and reach the stars. If the Cold War could dominate the Earth, why not take the battle beyond the sky? In 1957, the Soviet Union stunned the world with Sputnik, a small metal sphere that circled the globe and sent a signal into the void. It was more than a satellite. it was proof. Moscow had reached space first. Panic swept through Washington. Politicians warned of a missile gap. Schools drilled children on nuclear survival while engineers raced to answer the challenge. Out of that fear came NASA, an agency born not from curiosity, but from rivalry. And then, the moment that defined an era, July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface, broadcast live to 500 million people. The Cold War had gone cosmic. The moon wasn't just rock and dust, it was the ultimate trophy in a struggle for supremacy. But while Americans cheered the stars back on Earth, another reality played out on their television screens: Vietnam. Helicopters hovered over jungles, napalm scorched villages. Soldiers returned in body bags while protests erupted in the streets of America itself. The shining triumph of space exploration was shadowed by a war that divided a nation. And quietly, in labs and universities, something else was being born. Computers, massive, clunky machines humming away in the background. They didn't look like much, but they were the first whispers of a technological revolution that would soon reshape the human race. Hook to next era, but as rockets soared and computers blinked to life, something even bigger was coming. A wall was about to fall, an empire was about to collapse, and the Cold War would face its final dramatic act in the 1980s. The Soviet Union was showing cracks. The economy was stagnating, the people restless, and the military stretched thin. After years of trying to keep pace with America's endless spending, then came Mikhail Gorbachev. With bold words, perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost, openness, he promised to modernize the Soviet system. Instead, he opened a door that could not be closed. In 1989, the world watched as thousands of Germans crowded the Berlin Wall. Hammers struck stone, people climbed the concrete, and for the first time in decades, families separated by ideology embraced across the divide. The wall's collapse wasn't just the end of a barrier, it was the beginning of the end for the entire Soviet Empire. Within just 2 years, the impossible happened. The Soviet Union dissolved. Flags were lowered, borders redrawn, and the Cold War, a conflict that had defined half a century, was suddenly over. America stood alone at the top. The world was entering a new era, one where a single superpower would shape the future. The Cold War was over, and for the first time in modern history, there was only one superpower left standing. The 1990s belonged to America. Its culture was everywhere: Hollywood films filling theaters across the globe, McDonald's arches lighting up foreign streets, Microsoft software running on millions of new computers. Globalization was no longer an idea. It was reality, but America's power was not just cultural. In 1991, during the Gulf War, the world saw precision-guided missiles strike targets live on television. It was warfare like nothing before: fast, high-tech, unstoppable. Washington called it the New World Order. At the same time, a different revolution was unfolding. The internet, once confined to universities and scientists, was spreading into homes. Dial-up tones, chat rooms, and the first websites hinted at a future no one fully understood yet. It seemed like America's dominance would last forever. Yet, under the surface, new rivalries, new powers, and new conflicts were quietly taking shape. On the clear morning of September 11, 2001, the world stopped. Two planes cut through the New York skyline, slamming into the Twin Towers. Live on television, millions watched in disbelief as the towers burned, then crumbled. The dust, the screams, the desperate faces running through the streets of Manhattan, America, had been struck at its heart. The response was immediate. President George W. Bush declared a global war on terror. Within weeks, American forces were on the ground in Afghanistan, targeting the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. But this was just the beginning. In 2003, Washington turned its gaze to Iraq. The world watched shock and awe, the night sky over Baghdad lit with missiles and firepower that stunned even America's allies. The invasion toppled Saddam Hussein, but it also ignited years of bloody insurgency and sectarian violence. At home, life was changing too. Airports transformed into fortresses of security. Soldiers returned in coffins draped with flags, and the country carried a wound that would shape an entire generation. But amid the wars, a digital revolution was rewriting society. In 2004, a college project called Facebook began spreading beyond campuses. A year later, YouTube gave ordinary people the power to broadcast themselves. By 2007, Steve Jobs unveiled the iPhone, putting the internet in everyone's pocket. The decade that began with fire and ash ended with glowing screens and social networks. America was fighting wars abroad, but a new battlefield, digital, invisible, and unstoppable, was already rising. The 2010s began with fire in the streets. Across the Middle East and North Africa, millions rose up in what came to be known as the Arab Spring. Crowds filled Cairo's Tahrir Square, voices demanded freedom in Tunisia, Libya descended into chaos, and Syria spiraled into one of the bloodiest wars of the century. The old order in the Arab world was collapsing, and Washington suddenly faced a region it could no longer control. At the same time, far to the east, a new giant was stirring. China's economy exploded, fueled by factories, trade, and a state-driven vision of power. Skyscrapers rose in Beijing and Shanghai, bullet trains cut across the land, and the world realized America might not remain unchallenged for long. Then came Russia's return. In 2014, Vladimir Putin sent forces into Ukraine, annexing Crimea in a move that shocked Europe. Tanks rolled, soldiers without insignia appeared overnight, and the West suddenly realized the Cold War's shadow was not gone, it was back. Meanwhile, technology was accelerating faster than politics could keep up. Artificial intelligence, self-driving cars, and smartphones turned daily life into something unrecognizable from just a decade earlier. Entire industries rose and fell in years, not generations. The 2010s were a decade of shifting ground. Old powers tried to hold on, new ones rose with confidence, and the global order that had seemed stable in the 1990s was now breaking apart piece by piece. The new decade began with silence. Empty streets, shuttered shops, and masks on every face. COVID-19 wasn't just a health crisis, it was a global shockwave. Cities that never slept, like New York and London, went dark. Hospitals overflowed, morgues filled, and leaders scrambled for answers. The pandemic exposed how fragile the modern world truly was, but even as nations struggled to breathe, new storms gathered. In 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Tanks thundered across borders, missiles struck Kyiv, and millions of refugees poured into Europe. For the first time in generations, war had returned to the heart of the continent, America, and its allies rallied behind Ukraine, sending weapons, money, and promises, but also awakening fears of a wider conflict with Moscow. At the same time, another war erupted in the Middle East. Gaza burned under relentless bombardments, entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble. Images of families fleeing, of children under dust and debris, spread across the world in real time. The battles weren't just on the ground, they played out on social media, in headlines, in every living room, fueling debates about morality, power, and justice. And behind the smoke of war, another rivalry was shaping the century: America versus China. Trade disputes turned into technological battles. Microchips, 5G networks, and artificial intelligence became the new weapons of dominance. Washington moved to contain Beijing's rise, while China pushed back with its Belt and Road ambitions, drawing nations into its orbit. Meanwhile, humanity faced a quieter but deadlier threat: the climate crisis. Wildfires devoured forests in California and Australia, floods swallowed entire towns in Europe and Asia, and heat waves killed thousands. For the first time, people began to realize that the greatest enemy might not be another nation, but the planet itself turning against us. The 2020s are a decade where every front seems to be burning at once: pandemics, wars, technology, and the climate. And yet, in the chaos, one question hangs over everything:
The 20th century gave us war and triumph, division and unity. The 21st has already tested humanity with pandemics, digital revolutions, and conflicts echoing across every continent. Superpowers rise, empires fade, technology accelerates beyond our grasp, and even the planet itself pushes back against our excess. Each decade feels like a turning point, each year a crossroads. And yet, one truth remains: history never stops. The world is shifting faster than ever before. Tomorrow's battles, whether fought with soldiers, with algorithms, or with the climate itself, are already being written. History is watching, and its next chapter is ours to write. The world is not waiting. The future is already here, demanding answers. The real question is not who will lead, but if humanity can survive the century ahead.